Hey guys, this is Mark. In this video, we'll be talking about one of the most important concepts that exist in Backendless UI Builder, and that is data binding. It is so important for any kind of interactivity and integration with a database and integration with external services and really just wiring logic together in your UI applications that data binding really becomes foundational to UI Builder and just creating UI applications in Backendless. In this video, I will try to give you a detailed explanation of how data binding works, how to use it, how it applies to creating UIs, and of course, we will explore several examples that demonstrate data binding in action. Before we continue, I would like to start with the definition of data binding. So, a data binding is a bidirectional mapping of a component's property and a property in the underlying data model object. And the important thing to understand is that mapping is bidirectional. What that means is once you establish a mapping between a component's property and the property in the data model object, any assignment to the data model will be replicated in the component's property, and vice versa. Anytime you update that property in the component, that value from that component's property will be replicated in the data model. It's a fairly simple concept, but let me also illustrate this definition in a more visual way. So let's say we have a user interface component and it is an input field, and we have a data model. And let's establish a data binding between the value of that input field and a property in the data model object. And that property is going to be called first name, as you see here on the screen. The value of that property here visually will be illustrated by that blinking circle. And what happens here once the data binding is assigned, anytime a value is placed into the data model, that value is automatically replicated as the value of the input component. It's important to understand that here we're illustrating the binding with the value of the input component, but likewise the data binding can be associated with any other property of the input component. And that could be visibility, it could be the label that is displayed here. As you can see, it says first name. Pretty much all the properties that exist in the input component are data bindable. Likewise, if you take any other component in UI Builder, those components will have a bunch of data bindable properties, and all of those are going to be subject to this very rule. Now that you understand what data binding is, let's talk about data model. What is data model? Well, I mentioned earlier, it is an object, and you might be thinking, do I need to create this object? Where does it live? How do I work with this object? Do I need to make something special to create this data model? The answer is actually very simple. Data model is an object that is actually created for you by UI Builder, by the runtime that is created to run your applications. And in the most simplest terms, the data model is an object that is associated automatically. It's created for you and is associated with a common container hosting your components. So for instance, imagine that you have a toggle that you can turn on or off, and depending on that toggle, you want to change visibility of some other components within the same container. In the image you see on the screen, we have a block that contains both toggle and an image. And in this case, when the toggle is in the on state, the image is shown, and when it's in the off state, it would not be shown. So for instance, that's the logic you're after. In this case, both the toggle and the image are inside of the block, and the block becomes the common container. So when both the toggle and the image use data binding, the properties in the data model that they set are going to be sitting in the data model object associated with this block 1 that you see on the screen, because that block 1 becomes the common container. You could accomplish exactly the same thing by placing components directly on the page without having some other specialized common container. In other words, you do not necessarily have to use blocks or containers. You could literally place toggle and the image on the page and still use data binding, because the page itself provides the data model object in which you can set your own data binding properties. Now let's switch to UI Builder for some live demos. If you feel like you're lost and confused, that is okay. I hope things will become clearer now that you see exactly how it works. If you are with me and you've been following along, I hope the live demonstrations will only help you to cement this knowledge and really understand just from seeing exactly the power of data binding. I do have an empty page here. I will add a block to it, and let me center that block on the page. So right here, here's my block, and I will add a toggle and an image to it just to demonstrate exactly the functionality that I was describing earlier. This block, I will set it the direction left to right. Let me add an image. So now we have both toggle and the image. For the image, I will add a picture, and we'll make it a little bit larger so you can see this beautiful lizard. Okay, so now we have both toggle and the image in our block. Something that I should have mentioned earlier, and now I hopefully will be able to clarify it for you. When I was talking about the common container, what I should have mentioned, it is the common container that is enabled to have the data container behavior. I know it is a new concept. What is a data container behavior? If it is a block, notice that there is a checkbox right here, data container. When this checkbox is selected, then this block gets its own data model. If this checkbox is not enabled, then these components, the toggle and the image or anything else sitting in this block or any other block, they will use page as the data model, the page itself. It will become clearer in another demo that I will do later today in this video. But for now, let's keep things exactly as they are, just to keep things simple. So for the toggle and the image, or really any other component, whenever you select it and you get this toolbar right here, this icon right here will switch to logic. So select toggle and click on this icon. And in here, notice that we have a couple of properties which have the data binding field. So these are data bindable properties. And for the toggle, they are visibility, checked state, and disabled state. What happens is, if we were to specify a data binding property, and that will be a property in our data model, then anytime the toggle is checked or unchecked, then this property that we'll set right here will update the value in the data model. So for instance, the property will be show image. So simply by entering this property name right here, a lot of magic will happen. Specifically, when the toggle is clicked, then the data model will be updated. Specifically, the property show image in the data model will be updated with the value of the toggle's checked state. So if the toggle is checked, then the show image property will be set to true. And when the toggle is unchecked, then the show image property will be set to false. Likewise, if some other component somewhere else modifies the show image property in the data model, it will impact the state of the toggle. So you can control it from other places in your application. Let me go back to the user interface, select the image, and switch to the logic. And in here, for the image component, notice that we have data bindable properties such as visibility and the source URL. In our case, we care about visibility. Let's put show image here as well. And this will be sufficient. So what we have at this point is when the toggle is clicked, the show image property in the data model will be set to true or false, and that will immediately and instantly and automatically update the visibility of our image. Before we see how it works, let's set the toggle to be checked by default, and let's go into preview. So the toggle is on, the image is shown. Click the toggle and the image goes away. Of course, we haven't thought about keeping the toggle in the same place, but that's really beyond the point. It's going to take a few little tweaks just to keep it in the same place. However, as you can see, the functionality that I was describing is exactly there. Let me demonstrate something else. I'm going to remove toggle and the image, and I will add a input component into my block. I will also change the direction of the block, and I will also add text. So now we have text and the input component. For the input component, if I go to the properties, you see that there are a lot more data bindable properties for the input, specifically visibility, control of the label, value, read-only state, and just various others. In our case, what I want to accomplish is anytime I type something in the input component, I want text to show that value. Let me show you how that would work. So I go into the input component, and for the value, I will put input value. That's going to be the name of the property in the data model object. And for the text component, if I go to the properties, notice that there is a content logic data binding. And if I bind it to exactly the same property, input value, what will happen is anytime I type in text into the input, that text will show in the label. Let me show you how that works once we run it. So as you can see, as I really make any kind of changes in the input component, the label is updated automatically. Finally, let me show you another example where it will become clearer how the data container works. So in this case, I will create a very trivial calculator that will be capable of executing just one function, which is the addition of two values. So I have input, and the label for it is going to be argument x, and I will add another input into my block, and I will call this argument y. For both inputs, I will set the type to be number, since we are doing a calculator. So now we have x and y. Finally, I will add the text that will contain the result of that addition operation. So let's use data binding again. Go to properties for the x input, and then the data binding property is going to be property x. Same thing we're going to do for the input y, and then the data binding for the value, it's going to be property y. So at this point, whenever we type something into x, and whenever we type something into y, the data model will be updated with the values. So the next thing that we need to do is to make sure that we execute the logic of adding x and y and putting that value into text. Select text and go to logic. And notice that we have here data binding for content. However, data binding field in here can contain and can reference only one property, but we need to reference two, x and y. And in this case, when you need to execute more complex operation on the data that sits in your data model, this is when you can add logic. And that's exactly what we're going to do. Click Add Logic. And this is going to be the content logic for our text. Notice that in this case, we have reference to page data. And page data is our container for the data model. Let's use that to calculate x plus y. If we go into math, select this block, drag it into here, and then we need to extract value of the property x from page data. Go to object and get this, get property x from page data. Same thing for y, get property y from page data. And then you can select this addition operator, right click and select external inputs, and it just changes the layout a little bit where it becomes a little bit easier to read. So in this case, what we have is x and y use data binding to place value of x and place value of y into the data model. And then for the label, we execute logic to do the addition. Notice that the data binding field is empty, but we have logic. And in UI Builder, if you provide logic, it always takes the precedence over data binding. So even if I put any value into data binding, it will be ignored only because there is logic. Let's run this example and see how it works. So if I put some numbers in here, let's put some simpler numbers like 5 plus 7. The result is 12. So that works instantly. And let me go back to that concept of data container that I mentioned. Notice that in our example, the way it is currently written, the label that displays the result of the addition uses page data as the data model. Watch what happens if I select this block and I select it as the data container. In this case, both x and y, now whenever they are updated, whenever this data binding works, this one right here, x for input, it will start updating data model at the block level, because block becomes the common container that is data container enabled. And in this case, if I were to run this application right now without changing this logic right here, it simply will not work, simply because the values of x and y are sitting in block. And notice what happens as soon as I select block and I enable it as the data container. And if I go to the logic for the label, in here we also get block1 data. And this block1 data is the data model that contains these values. So in order for this to work, what we need to do is to replace page data with block1 data. And if we run it now, it will work exactly the same way as before. And the only difference now is that the data model sits in the actual block rather than page. I hope you found this useful, and I hope I made it clear for you as to how data binding works in UI Builder. And here, by the way, we're just scratching the surface. The same exact principle works for a lot more complex scenarios. And of course, there will be other videos and lessons where we talk about those. But for now, I know you already have enough information to start doing a lot of cool stuff in UI Builder. Once again, thank you. And as always, happy codeless coding.